The birth of medieval France, a kingdom in the making. Imagine a time when the land we now call France wasn't a kingdom, but a chaotic patchwork of tribes and territories, each with its own leader and rules. The year is 485. Rome, once the mighty empire, had crumbled, leaving Europe in confusion. In this chaos, a new power rose, one that would eventually unite Gaul and lay the foundation for what we now know as France. It wasn't like the idea of a kingdom just popped up. It took time, effort, and bloodshed. But amid the turmoil, a leader emerged, Clovis. You might not know him off the bat, but his role in the birth of medieval France is unforgettable. Clovis, born in 466, came to power in a fractured world. Gaul, what we now call France, was filled with Germanic tribes like the Franks, Visigoths, and Burgundians, all fighting for control. But Clovis, son of Childeric I, had a charisma and ambition that set him apart. Unlike others, he didn't just want to rule a small piece of land. He wanted it all. While many tribal kings were content with ruling small regions, Clovis had bigger dreams. His method to unite the Frankish tribes was brutal wars, alliances, and unyielding ambition. Through it all, Clovis united many tribes, laying the foundations for what would eventually become France. But here's the twist. Clovis's conversion to Christianity in 510 was a game-changer. In a world dominated by paganism, his shift aligned him with the powerful Christian Church, earning him an important ally. This move helped him solidify power and spread Christianity across his realm. Clovis's reign wasn't all smooth sailing. After his death in 520, his sons struggled to maintain unity. Still, his legacy endured. The Merovingian dynasty he founded laid the stage for the powerful monarchy that would shape France. Clovis's rise marked the beginning of a kingdom that would withstand invasions, grow, and evolve into the France we know today. Clovis I, the king who united the Franks. Imagine a world where chaos reigns, where fractured tribes fight for power, and survival is a daily struggle. This was the world of the Franks before Clovis I, a warrior king who, against all odds, united a fractured people and laid the foundation for modern France. Clovis wasn't born into luxury but into constant warfare, where each tribe carved out its own piece of land and power shifted with every battle. The Franks were one such tribe, but Clovis had something special: unwavering ambition, a sharp mind, and fierce determination. As the son of King Childeric I, Clovis inherited his father's kingdom, but he had to fight for it. At just 15, Clovis stepped into leadership after his father's death. But he wasn't content with ruling a small kingdom. He envisioned uniting the Frankish tribes that dotted Gaul and Germany. For years, these tribes had fought one another, and the idea of a unified kingdom seemed impossible. But Clovis didn't think so. Clovis knew he needed to be both a ruthless warrior and a clever tactician. His victory in the Battle of Soissons in 486 was key. By defeating Syagrius, a Roman general, he conquered northern Gaul, expanding his influence and consolidating power. Clovis's true genius, however, lay in his conversion to Christianity. After a fierce battle against the Alemanni, Clovis prayed to the Christian God, promising to convert if he won. When he emerged victorious, he saw it as a sign and became a Catholic. His conversion wasn't just personal, it was a political move, that earned him the support of the Roman Catholic Church and legitimated his rule. In 530, Clovis also established the Salic law, which would influence French legal traditions. Despite challenges, including family rivalries, Clovis died in 511, having created a unified Frankish kingdom. His descendants, the Merovingians, ruled for over 2 centuries, but none matched his vision. Clovis was more than a king. He was a visionary who, through bloodshed and ambition, created a lasting legacy that shaped France. Merovingians. The rise and fall of the first French dynasty. Imagine being thrust into the spotlight, destined to rule a growing kingdom, but surrounded by internal strife, endless power struggles, and a people who had never seen a true monarchy. This was the world of the Merovingians, the first royal dynasty of France. Their story is one of rise, ambition, and inevitable fall, all unfolding in the turbulent centuries after Clovis's unification of the Franks. When Clovis passed away in 541, his kingdom was left to his sons, but there was no clear succession plan. The sons fought over territory, power, and who should rule. This internal conflict marked the Merovingian dynasty for generations. The Merovingians, named after Merovec, an earlier semi-legendary king, ruled not by centralized power, but by a tribal form of governance. Their kings, called long-haired kings, were symbolic figures. Their long hair was seen as a sign of their divine right to rule, but they were often weak, relying on nobles to handle the day-to-day affairs. The real power often lay with the mayors of the palace officials who managed the kingdom, while the kings lived in luxury or squabbled over succession. One such mayor was Charles Martel, who would rise to power and secure the future of the Carolingian family. During the reign of Dagobert I, the Merovingians showed moments of strength, but after his death in 639, chaos returned. The kings couldn't create lasting unity, and the nobles grew stronger, often caring more for their own power than for stability. In 750, after years of internal strife, Pepin the Short, mayor of the palace, overthrew the last Merovingian king, Childeric III. Pepin was crowned, marking the end of the Merovingian rule and the rise of the Carolingians. Though short on lasting power, the Merovingians laid the groundwork for medieval France. Their dynasty's internal struggles and fall revealed that even the mightiest can be brought down by infighting and lack of authority. Their legacy endures in France's complicated history. The Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne's grand vision. Have you ever wondered how one man can leave such an indelible mark on history? Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was that man. In the late 8th and early 9th centuries, he forged the Carolingian Empire, which spanned much of Western Europe and reshaped the continent. In 750, Europe was a patchwork of warring tribes and fractured kingdoms. The Roman Empire had crumbled, and there was no true ruler. The Franks, led by the Carolingian dynasty, held power. Charlemagne wasn't content with ruling a small kingdom, he had bigger ambitions. After inheriting the throne in 774, he aimed to unite Europe. His empire would eventually cover modern-day France, Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of Italy. What made Charlemagne's reign so special? It wasn't just his military victories, though they were impressive. Charlemagne understood the importance of culture and governance. His goal was to revive the glory of the Roman Empire, not just through conquest, but by establishing a unified Christian order. At the heart of Charlemagne's reign was his relationship with the Catholic Church. In 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans, reviving the idea of a Western Roman Empire with Charlemagne at its helm. Charlemagne didn't stop there. After becoming emperor, he launched brutal campaigns against the Saxons, converting them to Christianity. His empire was built on the belief that Christianity was its foundation. He also focused on maintaining order by appointing counts to govern regions and sending royal officials, known as missi dominici, to oversee them. Charlemagne's laws were enforced throughout the empire. Beyond politics, Charlemagne valued culture. He fostered a Carolingian Renaissance, inviting scholars, poets, and artists to his court. His reign marked a golden age of intellectual achievement in medieval Europe. Though Charlemagne's empire fragmented after his death in 814, his legacy shaped Europe for centuries. His vision for a united Christian empire changed history, inspiring future rulers, feudal France, lords, vassals, and the birth of castles. Imagine waking up one cold morning in the year 1000, surrounded by vast, wild forests. The air is thick with the scent of pine. You're in a small village, but the world around you is anything but simple. France, in the early medieval period, was transforming, and you're at the heart of it. Welcome to feudal France. Feudalism, the system that tied the medieval world together, was central to France. After the fall of the Roman Empire, there was no single ruler. Instead, local lords and warriors held power over territories. They were not just landowners, but power brokers, commanding loyalty from those who lived on their land. This was feudalism, a web of allegiances, promises, and land grants. At the top of the feudal pyramid was the king, but his control was often weak. Below him, powerful lords controlled vast areas, often given land in exchange for loyalty and military service. These lords didn't rule alone, they had vassals. Vassals were lesser lords who swore loyalty to a higher lord in exchange for land. The relationship was built on mutual benefit. The vassal would promise to fight for the lord, and the lord would provide land and protection. Loyalty was crucial. Betrayal could mean losing land or life. Feudalism also created a tight-knit society with defined roles. At the bottom were peasants and serfs, called villeins, who worked the land and gave a portion of their crops in exchange for protection. As you moved up the ladder, you gained more power, but also more obligations. Lords, too, had lords to answer to, and the king remained a distant figure. One thing that defined feudal France were the castles. Castles weren't just homes, they were symbols of power. Walking through the countryside, you'd see towering stone structures on hilltops, built to protect, defend, and dominate. The first castles were simple motte and bailey designs. A mound with a wooden structure on top and a courtyard below. But as raids and conflicts grew, castles became stone fortresses with thick walls, drawbridges, and moats. For lords, castles were military strongholds and hubs of social activity. Lords would hold court, dispense justice, and summon vassals to pledge allegiance or gather for battle. The larger the castle, the greater the power of the lord. Life inside a castle wasn't easy. Despite their size, castles were cold, damp, and uncomfortable. The thick walls kept out light and warmth, and life for peasants was little better. They lived in small homes with little control over their lives. The system kept order, but also kept most people at the mercy of their superiors. Lords worried about protecting their land, while peasants focused on survival. Feudalism, castles, and the rise of lords created a complex but fragile society. Everyone had a role, but with those roles came obligations. If one link in the chain broke, the system could collapse. Over time, this system would evolve, giving rise to new ideas and rebellions, eventually paving the way for modern France. If you visit France today, you can still see the ruins of castles. They stand as reminders of a system built on the backs of lords, vassals, and towering stone fortresses. Viking raids. When France felt the fury of the Northmen. Imagine standing on the shores of northern France. It's a crisp morning, the air thick with mist. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by horns, the clanging of metal, and the terrifying sight of Viking longships emerging from the fog. The Viking raids have begun. For centuries, France had lived in relative peace, but nothing prepared them for the Vikings. These seafaring warriors from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were strategic, brutal, and relentless. Their target? France, with its rich lands and strategic position. For decades, the Vikings would terrorize the northern and western coasts of France. The first Viking raids began in the late 8th century, but it was the 9th century when their fury truly struck. Viking longships were infamous for striking quickly and retreating before local forces could respond. Towns, monasteries, and villages along the coast and rivers became prime targets. In 873, the Vikings attacked Paris, a small but important trading hub. They pillaged and burned the city, forcing the terrified inhabitants to surrender. This wasn't a one-off. The Vikings returned again and again. King Charles the Bald struggled to defend his realm as the city endured Viking pressure for years. But the Vikings weren't just after gold and silver, they came to claim land and expand their territories. The real impact began when the Vikings brought change with them. After years of conflict, in 933, a pivotal deal was struck between Viking leader Rollo and King Charles the Simple of France. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte granted Rollo land in Normandy, which would become the Duchy of Normandy. Rollo, once a Viking raider, became its first duke. This was a game-changer. The Vikings, who had once struck fear, were now part of the French political fabric. They assimilated and slowly became a new class of French nobility. Over generations, their descendants would become powerful lords, and Normandy would become one of the most influential regions in France. The Viking influence didn't stop there. As they settled, they brought new ideas, cultures, and technologies. Skilled farmers, builders, and traders, the Vikings helped shape the economy and culture of Normandy. In fact, the name Normandy comes from the word Northmen, a lasting testament to the Vikings' impact. Their legendary ships, designed for both seas and shallow rivers, played a crucial role in Viking expansion across Europe, from England to Ireland and even the Mediterranean. By the mid-10th century, Viking raids in France had turned into settlements. The terror once brought by Viking raids evolved into the Normans, a powerful force in French history. While Viking raids faded, their legacy remained, shaping France for centuries. Without the Viking raids, would the Duchy of Normandy have existed? Would the Normans have become a political powerhouse? The Viking raids, once seen as unstoppable destruction, eventually led to one of the most significant shifts in medieval history, the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Vikings didn't just change France's history, They shaped it. They were not merely raiders but builders of futures. The Treaty of Verdun, a divided empire, a fragmented future. Imagine an empire so vast that it stretched from the icy north to the warm Mediterranean, with different cultures, languages, and customs. This was the Carolingian Empire, built by Charlemagne, whose reign unified much of Western Europe. But after his death in 814, the empire began to unravel, leading to the Treaty of Verdun, a historic agreement that divided the empire into three parts and shaped Europe's future. Charlemagne's sons, Lothair, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German were powerful but faced the impossible task of managing such a vast empire. The empire's balance of loyalty, military might, and religious support was tipping. By the time Louis the Pious died in 840, his sons were ready to claim their share. These brothers fought over control, and by 843, after years of rivalry and civil war, they decided to divide the empire. This led to the Treaty of Verdun in 845, which divided the Carolingian Empire into three parts. Lothair received the Central Kingdom, stretching from the Low Countries to Italy, which would later become the Holy Roman Empire. Charles the Bald ruled West Francia, modern-day France, and Louis the German ruled East Francia, which would eventually become Germany. At first, the division seemed like a fair solution, but it caused fragmentation and instability. The unity Charlemagne had built was lost, and the empire became three struggling kingdoms. The Treaty of Verdun had lasting effects, especially in shaping the future of France and Germany. For France, the treaty marked the beginning of its long journey to define itself as a kingdom. Over time, France would evolve its own political identity, with the Capetian dynasty rising in the 10th century to provide much-needed stability. The Treaty of Verdun helped set the stage for this transformation. For Germany, East Francia became a patchwork of smaller states facing political instability. The Holy Roman Empire, which emerged from Lothair's lands, was often a loose confederation, not a unified empire. It wasn't until the 19th century that Germany would unify under Prussian leadership. Culturally, the Treaty of Verdun also deepened the divide between France and Germany. West Francia's language evolved into Old French, while East Francia's languages became the roots of modern German. These cultural differences only grew over time, further separating the two regions. The division also weakened the empire's defense against outside threats. Viking raids took advantage of the empire's disarray, especially along the coasts. The fragmented kingdoms struggled to protect themselves, leading to further chaos and decline. In the end, the Treaty of Verdun didn't just divide an empire, it created lasting divisions. It set the stage for centuries of political and cultural conflict, shaping the nations of France and Germany. The impact of Verdun would echo through time, affecting Europe in ways no one could have predicted. The Capetian dynasty, the beginning of true French power. Picture this: a kingdom torn apart by centuries of conflict, invasions, and instability, now beginning to coalesce into something more powerful. The birth of the Capetian dynasty was the spark that ignited France's rise. In the late 10th century, after Viking invasions and feudal chaos, the Capetians emerged, marking a turning point in France's history. In 977, the Frankish Empire had long since fragmented. Powerful lords ruled their own fiefs, and the monarchy was weak. But a new family, the Capetians, would rise to power. At the time, France was divided, and the Carolingian dynasty had lost its grip. The Capetians weren't wealthy or powerful at first. They were relatively modest compared to the mighty lords of the time. But they had something more important: strategy, patience, and a commitment to the long game. Hugh Capet, the founder of the dynasty, was elected king in 977. His rise was political. He was seen as a neutral figure who could work with the powerful nobles. His election wasn't about conquest, but compromise. Hugh's reign started small, ruling only Paris. The real power lay with the feudal lords. But Hugh understood that power isn't just about control, it's about shaping the future. Instead of challenging the nobles directly, Hugh and his descendants built alliances with the church and nobles. By aligning with the church, the Capetians gained legitimacy and moral authority. It was a masterstroke, giving them the religious backing needed to solidify their rule. The Capetians also focused on dynastic continuity, passing the crown directly down through their bloodline. This created stability, unlike the Carolingians, whose kingdom was divided among several heirs. The Capetians maintained a direct line of succession, solidifying their power and creating a sense of permanence. Over time, the Capetians grew stronger, securing strategic regions like Normandy, Aquitaine, and Brittany. They increased their authority over the nobility, forcing them to pay homage. By the reign of Hugh's successor, Robert II, the Capetians were no longer mere figureheads. They controlled more land, and their authority spread across the kingdom. The significant turning point came under King Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, in the 12th century. He asserted royal authority over the feudal lords, fought rebellions, and expanded royal control. By the end of his reign, the Capetians were firmly established as the true rulers of France. But it wasn't just military conquest. The Capetians understood the importance of legitimacy, cultivating a sense of unity and shared identity. Their dynasty represented stability, which resonated with both the clergy and common people. The Capetians faced many challenges, from rival dynasties to invasions by England and the Holy Roman Empire. But through strategic marriages, religious alliances, and control over their royal domain, they turned France into one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. By the 14th century, the Capetians had established a centralized monarchy, setting the foundation for France's greatness. The long, slow climb from a small realm to a European powerhouse was built through strategy and patience, laying the groundwork for a nation that would dominate Europe. The Capetian dynasty didn't just rule, it built the foundation for a powerful kingdom that would endure. From humble beginnings, they created the framework for one of the most enduring monarchies in history. Though their reign ended with the death of Charles IV in 1437, their impact on France and the world was profound. The Capetians were not just kings. They were the architects of French power. The Norman Conquest, how France shaped England's fate. Imagine living in England in 1066, when the kingdom is in turmoil. After the death of King Edward the Confessor, 3 men claimed the throne: Harold Godwinson, Harold Hardrada, and William, Duke of Normandy. Harold seized the throne, but William, with his Norman blood, wasn't about to let it go uncontested. Why would a duke from Normandy care about the English throne? William had a distant claim through his cousin, Edward the Confessor, who had allegedly promised him the throne. But when Harold was crowned, William saw it as a betrayal. In 1066, he gathered a formidable army and crossed the English Channel, landing in southern England. The Battle of Hastings, on the 14th of October 1066, would become one of the most famous battles in history. The battle was fierce, and Harold was killed, marking the end of English resistance. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, beginning a new era. But William's victory didn't just change the throne, it reshaped England's future. After the conquest, William replaced many Anglo-Saxon nobles with Normans. The English aristocracy, once powerful, was now overshadowed by Norman lords who brought with them French customs and language. French began to dominate the court, law, and governance. William's construction of castles, like the Tower of London, symbolized Norman control. These castles weren't just military fortresses but statements of authority. The spread of Norman architecture, law, and feudal practices reshaped English society, blending Anglo-Saxon and Norman cultures. One of the most significant changes was in language. Norman French became the language of the ruling class, church, and law. Over time, it merged with Old English to create Middle English. French words like court, council, and crown became common in English, deeply influencing its structure. The Normans also introduced a feudal system where the king owned all the land and nobles held it in exchange for military service. This system defined England's social structure, with loyalty to the king being paramount. The most lasting impact of the Norman conquest was the blending of cultures. England's identity, once shaped by Anglo-Saxon traditions, was now influenced by Norman customs. The English were now part of a larger European world, tied to France not just through the royal family, but through culture, language, and law. The Norman conquest would shape both England and France. The new English monarchy, though still distinct, became more entwined with French affairs. The Norman bloodline in England would eventually lead to the 100 Years' War, a long conflict for supremacy between the two kingdoms. The Norman conquest was more than a military victory. It was a cultural and political transformation. It reshaped England's destiny, blending French and English traditions into something new. The echoes of 1066 are still felt today in language, law, and the castles that remain. The 100 Years' War. France's fight for survival. Picture this. It's 1437, and you're on a battlefield in northern France. The air is thick with sweat, blood, and fear. The sounds of clashing swords, shouting soldiers, and pounding hooves fill the air. You're caught in the middle of the 100 Years' War, one of the longest and most brutal conflicts in European history. It began in 1333, when English King Edward III claimed the French throne, arguing he was the rightful heir through his French royal lineage. But France had its own king, Charles IV, and the French weren't about to let an Englishman take their crown. The war lasted over a century, with battles, truces, and periods of tension. It was about dynastic succession, land control, and national pride, but at its core, it was a fight for survival, especially for France. Edward III's claim was only the spark. England already controlled significant French territories like Gascony and Calais, and wasn't willing to lose them. The English made early progress, taking much of northern France. Meanwhile, France struggled with internal divisions. The French monarchy was weak, and several ineffective kings ruled during the war. The people were divided, with some loyal to the king, others to the nobles, and still others siding with the English. Then came Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Lorraine. At 16, she claimed to have visions from saints telling her to support Charles VII, the Dauphin, and help him reclaim his throne. Joan became a symbol of hope. She convinced Charles to let her lead an army to lift the siege of Orléans. Against all odds, she succeeded. Joan's victory was a turning point. It gave the French army new confidence and showed the English weren't invincible, but her triumphs were short-lived. Captured by the English in 1431, Joan was tried for heresy and burned at the stake. Her death was a blow to the French cause, but it fueled their resolve to continue the fight. Joan's martyrdom turned her into a national hero. Inspired by Joan, Charles VII rallied his forces. By 1445, the English were forced to sign the Treaty of Picquigny, ending their ambitions in France. The final blow came in 1483, when England lost its last possession in France, Calais. The war also changed the way battles were fought. The rise of longbowmen gave the English a major advantage. These soldiers could shoot farther and more accurately than the French knights, who relied on heavy armour. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 showed this advantage. Though outnumbered, the English longbowmen decimated French knights. The war also marked the decline of feudalism. The need for professional armies meant the old system of knights and vassals didn't work anymore. The French began building a modern army, setting the stage for future military developments. By the time the war ended, France had been transformed. The country was unified, with the English driven out. The cost had been high, with tens of thousands dead, and the land ravaged by war and disease. But France emerged stronger and more united. The war also led to the rise of absolute monarchy and a powerful central government. The 100 Years' War shaped the future of France, making it a powerful and resilient nation. Its echoes would continue to resonate throughout French history. Joan of Arc, the maid who changed the course of history. Imagine being a teenager and suddenly finding yourself in the middle of a war that's been raging for years. You're from a small village, but somehow you're convinced you have a divine mission. This is the story of Joan of Arc, a name that still resonates more than 600 years later. But how did a poor peasant girl from Domremy rise to become one of the most iconic figures in history? In 1430, France was in the midst of the 100 Years' War with England. The French throne was in turmoil after King Charles VI fell ill, and his son Charles VII struggled to claim the throne. Amidst the chaos, a young peasant girl named Joan began hearing voices from saints telling her to support Charles VII and help him reclaim his throne. Joan's visions might have seemed unbelievable, but she believed them with all her heart. At just 17, she travelled to the royal court and convinced Charles VII of her divine calling. Though sceptical, Charles put his trust in her, desperate for help. Joan was given armour, a banner, and a small army. She was no longer just Joan of Arc. She became the Maid of Orleans, destined to save France. Her first major test came when she arrived at the besieged city of Orléans in 1429. The English had surrounded it for months, but Joan led the charge, rallied the troops, and broke the siege. The victory at Orleans was a turning point. It sparked hope and belief in a French victory, and people began to rally behind Charles VII's claim to the throne. Joan and Charles marched to Reims, where Charles VII was crowned King of France, a direct result of Joan's leadership. The French people saw their king crowned, and for the first time they truly believed in their victory over the English. However, Joan's journey took a tragic turn. In 1430 she was captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English, during a military campaign. The English put her on trial for heresy, witchcraft and cross-dressing, as she had worn men's clothing during her campaigns. The trial was a political move to discredit her. Joan defended herself bravely, but at just 19, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning at the stake in Rouen on May 30th, 1431. Her death was a devastating loss, but her legacy only grew. Joan was posthumously exonerated in 1425, and in 1920 she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Her story has inspired generations, not just for her military success, but for her courage, faith, and unwavering belief in her cause. Joan of Arc was the heart and soul of France's fight for survival. Her short life changed the course of history, not just for France, but for the world. She remains a symbol of resistance, faith, and the power of conviction, the Black Death. France in the grip of a deadly plague. Imagine a time when death didn't knock, it barged in without warning. The year is 1437, and the Black Death is sweeping across Europe. Already battered by war, famine, and instability, France is unprepared for the devastation that follows. It began as a rumour from the East, strange deaths in Italy and Spain. At first, it seemed distant, but soon the plague's shadow reached France in the summer of 1439. By then, it was too late. The Black Death struck swiftly, decimating entire communities in days, a merciless, unstoppable force. The plague was unlike anything seen before. It wasn't just a fever or cough, it was a deadly combination of symptoms that left doctors powerless. Victims suffered sudden fever, chills, and fatigue, followed by painful, swollen buboes, lymph nodes, that turned black, giving the disease its name. Within days, most infected would die, and recovery was rare. The death rate was staggering, with up to 75% of those infected dying within a week. For France, already worn down by the 100 Years' War, the Black Death was catastrophic. It wasn't just the physical toll. The social and psychological devastation was profound. Cities like Paris and Marseille were hit hardest. Streets emptied, markets closed, and entire families vanished. Survivors struggled to bury the dead as the mortality rate soared. What made the plague so devastating was its rapid spread. Fleas carried by rats transmitted the bacteria, and the movement of armies, traders, and pilgrims carried the disease across the country. As the crisis deepened, fear led to scapegoating, with many blaming witches or Jews, and vulnerable groups were targeted. In France, as in much of Europe, fear gripped the population. Churches were flooded with people praying for divine mercy, hoping that the plague would pass them by. But despite all the prayers, the death toll continued to rise. The wealthy tried to escape by fleeing to the countryside, but no one was immune. The plague didn't care if you were rich or poor. It took them all. Those who remained behind tried to carry on with life, but everything had changed. The streets were silent, the air thick with the smell of death. One of the hardest hit areas was the port city of Marseille, which became a death zone. Ships from infected regions arrived, bringing the plague with them. The once thriving trade city became a ghost town, its population decimated. In Paris, the streets were filled with the dead, their bodies left unburied, contributing to the already unbearable stench of disease. In the countryside, rural communities were also devastated. Farms were abandoned as workers perished, leading to a crippling shortage of food. For many, survival became a matter of chance. But the Black Death wasn't just a crisis of health, it was a social and economic disaster as well. The collapse of the labour force caused by the deaths led to a massive shortage of workers, which in turn created a scarcity of food and goods. Fields lay fallow, and trade dwindled as merchants and craftsmen died or fled. The plague also had a long-lasting impact on the social fabric of French society. With so many deaths, social order began to break down. Families were left without breadwinners, communities without leaders, and the fabric of society itself seemed to unravel. The wealth gap grew even wider, as the poor and the vulnerable were hit hardest, while the rich were better able to flee or protect themselves. But the Black Death also set the stage for change. It brought about a series of social, economic, and cultural shifts that would reverberate through the centuries. The massive death toll meant that there were fewer people to work the land, which led to a rise in wages for peasants and labourers. The scarcity of labour forced landowners to offer better pay and working conditions to those who remained. This shift would eventually contribute to the weakening of the feudal system in France, as serfs and peasants began to demand better rights and greater freedom. Another unexpected consequence was the effect the Black Death had on the Church. As the plague ravaged Europe, many began to question the Church's power. The clergy, often unable to offer any real protection or cures, lost some of their influence. People began to look elsewhere for answers, leading to a gradual shift in religious practices and beliefs. The Church's inability to prevent the plague or provide comfort to the suffering left many searching for other spiritual answers. The Black Death did not end with the wave of deaths that struck in the mid-14th century. It came in waves, periodically returning to Europe for decades, each time with less intensity, but still leaving destruction in its path. In France, it left deep scars, physical, social, and psychological, that would take generations to heal. The plague was a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the power of forces beyond human control. For France, the Black Death was a defining moment in its history. It marked the end of an era and set the stage for a new one, where social structures began to shift, where the economy would never be the same, and where people would never look at life or death in quite the same way. As we look back on this dark chapter, we are reminded of how deeply the Black Death changed France, and how the scars of this terrifying plague would shape the future of the country for centuries to come. The growth of towns and trade in medieval France. Imagine a time when the streets you walk down were barely roads, when bustling markets and busy town squares were nothing more than a distant dream. In the early Middle Ages, life in France was far from what we would recognize today. Most people lived in rural villages, under the shadow of feudal lords, farming the land and living simple, isolated lives. But, over time, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly, the world started to change, and France saw the birth of something that would shape its future. Towns, markets, and trade. The growth of towns in medieval France wasn't an overnight phenomenon. It was a slow, almost imperceptible transformation that took centuries. But by the 12th century, a new pattern had emerged. Towns began to grow, and with them, trade flourished. And as trade increased, so did the economic power of these towns, which would eventually change the social and political structure of France itself. The story starts in the feudal system, where the vast majority of people lived under the control of local lords. The rural economy was based on agriculture, and towns were few and far between. The idea of urban life seemed distant, overshadowed by the dominance of the countryside. But even in these early days, there were signs of a growing desire for change. Some regions, particularly along rivers and coastal areas, had been natural hubs for trade. These places, like Paris, Bordeaux, and Marseille, saw merchants and traders come and go, exchanging goods and ideas. But it wasn't just about trading goods. It was also about the slow evolution of the towns themselves. As local lords began to grant more privileges to these settlements, the idea of a town charter emerged. These charters were essentially documents that granted towns certain freedoms and privileges, like the right to hold markets, collect taxes, and govern themselves to a certain extent. With these privileges, towns started to come alive. They attracted merchants, craftsmen, and even people from the countryside who were looking for a better life. For the first time, towns were no longer just small settlements. They were growing centers of commerce and industry. The rise of towns also coincided with a dramatic shift in the way people viewed wealth. In the past, wealth had been measured primarily by land. But as trade grew, money began to take on a new importance. The ability to buy and sell goods, rather than just owning land, became a sign of prosperity. Merchants, artisans, and traders found themselves in a new position of power. They began to establish guilds, associations of workers and tradespeople who would protect their interests and regulate their industries. These guilds were essential to the growth of towns, helping to organize trade, set prices, and maintain quality standards. One of the key factors in the growth of trade was the expansion of Europe's trade networks. By the 12th and 13th centuries, France was becoming an integral part of a broader European and Mediterranean trade system. Goods like wool, wine, cloth, and salt were in high demand. French merchants began to trade these goods with neighboring countries, and soon France was exporting much of what it produced. Towns like Paris, Toulouse, and Lyon became major centers of commerce, while ports like Marseille and Rouen became bustling hubs for goods coming in from across the seas. But trade wasn't just about luxury goods and raw materials. It was also about the exchange of knowledge and ideas. As merchants from across Europe and the Mediterranean met in French towns, they brought with them new technologies, art, and science. The rise of towns and trade created an atmosphere of innovation. Ideas that had once been confined to the courts of kings and nobles began to spread more widely. Scholars and artisans in towns like Paris were able to collaborate, leading to advancements in everything from architecture to mathematics. Yet, while towns and trade were growing, they were not without their challenges. The rise of these urban centers often led to tensions with the old feudal order. Towns were seen as a threat by some nobles, who feared the power of wealthy merchants and the growing influence of urban populations. These tensions led to frequent conflicts between town dwellers and the nobility. In some cases, this even sparked violent uprisings. The bourgeoisie, the middle class made up of merchants, bankers, and artisans, were growing in power, and they didn't always see eye to eye with the feudal lords. Despite these tensions, the rise of towns and trade continued. Over time, the French monarchy began to see the value in supporting urban growth. Kings realized that strong towns and a thriving trade network could help strengthen their own power. Towns provided a reliable source of income through taxes, and the wealth generated by trade helped to fund the monarchy's military campaigns and infrastructure projects. Kings like Louis IX, also known as Saint Louis, actively supported the development of French towns, understanding that they were key to France's future. By the end of the 13th century, France was a very different place. The countryside was still dominated by feudal lords, but the towns had become centers of commerce, culture, and innovation. The once isolated rural life was now linked to a larger economic system, and the people living in towns had a level of independence and power that they had never had before. The growth of towns and trade not only transformed the economy, it reshaped the very fabric of French society. But the story didn't end there. The rise of towns and trade continued to influence French history in the centuries that followed. It played a role in the decline of feudalism, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and the eventual emergence of a centralized French state. And as trade expanded, so too did the cultural exchange that would shape the Renaissance and beyond. The growth of towns and trade in medieval France was more than just an economic shift. It was a social and political revolution, one that would leave a lasting impact on the country's future. It transformed France from a fragmented, rural society into a dynamic, interconnected kingdom. And as the towns grew, so too did the power of those who lived within them, marking the beginning of a new chapter in French history, the rise of the knights. France's chivalric culture. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A young knight, his armor glinting in the sunlight as he rides across a battlefield, sword drawn, eyes locked on the enemy. He's not just fighting for his lord or his country, he's fighting for something much deeper. A code, a set of values that defines his very existence. This image of the knight is one we've all seen in movies, books, and legends. But what made the knight of medieval France so much more than just a warrior? What created the chivalric culture that elevated knights to heroic figures and icons of virtue? This is the rise of the knights, and how France gave birth to the culture that would define an era. The roots of chivalry in France go back to the chaotic years following the fall of the Roman Empire. As Europe fragmented and feudal systems began to take shape, the need for warriors who could protect both land and people became increasingly important. The term knight originally referred to a mounted soldier, someone who could afford a horse and the necessary armor. But as time went on, the role of the knight grew more complex. These men were no longer just soldiers. They became symbols of honor, loyalty, and courage. France, with its deep ties to the Carolingian Empire and later the Capetian Dynasty, was at the center of this transformation. By the 11th and 12th centuries, knights were no longer merely professional fighters. They were expected to follow a code, the code of chivalry. This code, though it varied in different regions and times, was based on principles of honor, bravery, loyalty, and courtesy. It was a way of life, a set of unwritten rules that every knight was expected to uphold. So, what did it mean to be a knight in medieval France? It wasn't just about the ability to wield a sword or ride a horse. The rise of the knight was closely tied to the ideals of Christianity, which were woven into the fabric of French chivalric culture. Knights were often expected to protect the weak, defend the church, and fight in the name of God. Crusades, launched by French kings and nobles, became a prime example of this idea. The knights who set off on these religious wars didn't just do so for land or wealth. They did it to earn spiritual merit, to secure their place in heaven. It wasn't just about conquest, it was about righteousness. The influence of the church over knights was undeniable. Monasteries and abbeys played a crucial role in shaping the moral code of chivalry. The concept of courtly love also emerged during this time, intertwining the ideals of romance and honor. A knight was not only expected to fight bravely, but to also exhibit qualities of gentleness and respect, especially towards women. Courtly love, the idea of a knight serving a lady with unwavering devotion, became one of the central themes in literature, particularly in the works of French poets like Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote about the legendary tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. While these tales of knights in shining armour might seem distant from the reality of medieval life, they weren't far from how knights saw themselves. The ideal knight lived a life of both physical and spiritual discipline. To become a knight, a young boy would typically undergo a rigorous training process that began in his early childhood. As a page, he would learn the basics of courtly behaviour, reading, and music. As a squire, he would begin training in combat, learning to ride, handle weapons, and serve his knight. Finally, after proving his worth, a young squire could be knighted, often in a formal ceremony where he swore an oath to uphold the values of chivalry. But it wasn't just about gallant knights riding into battle with their swords held high. The chivalric culture of France also brought about the creation of castles, tournaments, and a society that glorified knightly virtues. Tournaments, like jousting and melee battles, became popular in France and across Europe. These events were not just for entertainment. They were a way for knights to prove their skills, gain prestige, and sometimes even win the favour of noble women. The concept of the knight in shining armour wasn't just a metaphor. It was a real aspiration for many. As the centuries passed, the role of the knight began to evolve. The rise of gunpowder and firearms in the late Middle Ages made knights' traditional roles on the battlefield less significant. However, the ideals of chivalry would continue to influence European society, particularly in France. The knights of the medieval era may have faded from the front lines of warfare, but their image lived on in the art, literature, and culture of Europe. The noble knight, bound by honour, love, and duty, would become a central figure in the tales of the Renaissance, the Baroque period, and beyond. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the knights and their chivalric culture was how it shaped the European concept of nobility. Being a knight wasn't just about holding land or power. It was about embodying the virtues that society held dear. The rise of the knights, particularly in France, helped lay the foundation for what we now think of as the medieval nobility. A class of people who were not only landowners, but also custodians of culture, values, and ideals. The knight's journey from soldiers to symbols of virtue and honour is one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval France. Their rise marked the beginning of a new age, one where honour and duty became intertwined with power and influence. They were more than just warriors. They were the embodiment of an entire cultural revolution, and even today, the tales of their valour, their oaths, and their gallant quests continue to inspire us. From the courtly love of the troubadours to the battlefield heroics immortalized in French epics, the knights of medieval France helped shape the very notion of what it meant to be a hero. Their legacy lives on, not just in history, but in the stories we continue to tell. The French monarchy, from kings to absolute rulers. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping into the halls of the French royal court in the 16th century. The air is thick with the scent of perfume, candle wax, and the rustling of silken gowns. The sound of lavish music fills the rooms as nobles, their faces painted with the finest cosmetics, gossip and laugh in gilded chambers. But at the centre of it all, standing above everyone else, is the king. He is the heart and soul of the kingdom, the centre of all power and influence, and his word is law. This is a world where power is absolute, and that power, over time, has been carefully crafted and honed by centuries of French monarchy. The idea of a king being the ultimate authority in a nation didn't just happen overnight. It was a gradual, often violent transformation that began with the early kings of France. The journey from the modest rulers of the Middle Ages to the supreme monarchs of the Ancien Régime is one of consolidation, political maneuvering, and the gradual accumulation of power. In the early days of the French monarchy, the king's power was far from absolute. For centuries, the French kings ruled in a more feudal system, where their authority was shared with powerful nobles, church officials, and regional leaders. The king had a crown, of course, but often had little control outside the royal court. Power was decentralized. Local lords wielded great authority over their own territories, often to the point where they could defy the king's commands. The French monarch's power, while important, was very much limited by the need to maintain alliances with these nobles. But as time passed, the kings of France started to change the game. The pivotal shift began under the reign of Louis XI in the late 15th century. Known as the Spider King for his intricate web of political maneuvering, Louis XI worked tirelessly to weaken the power of the nobles, bringing more and more of France under the direct control of the crown. He used a mixture of diplomacy, force, and manipulation to consolidate royal power. Louis XI wasn't just playing the game of kingship, he was rewriting the rules. By the time of Francis I in the 16th century, the French monarchy was beginning to take on a new form. Francis wasn't just interested in expanding his territories or consolidating power, he was deeply invested in making the monarchy an undeniable force. During his reign, France saw the establishment of a more centralized state. The king made it clear that he, not the nobles or the church, would be the supreme authority in all matters of the state. His reign marked a defining moment for the French monarchy. No longer was it a shared power structure, but one where the king held the upper hand. Then came Louis XIV, the Sunday King, and the true rise of absolute monarchy in France. Louis XIV took the idea of centralized power and made it an unshakable reality. Born in one of the most turbulent periods of French history, Louis ascended the throne as a young boy after the death of his father, Louis XIII. His early years as king were marked by the chaos of the Fronde, a series of civil wars led by discontented nobles and parliamentarians. These uprisings left Louis with a burning desire to stamp out any challenge to his authority. As he grew older, Louis XIV became determined to centralize all political power in his hands. He famously said, "L'État, c'est moi," which translates to, "I am the state." He didn't just rule the kingdom. He was the kingdom. Louis XIV took full control of the military, the judiciary, and the economy. He built a system where all decisions, no matter how small, had to pass through his court at Versailles. Under Louis XIV, the monarchy became more than just a ruling body. It became a symbol of unity, power, and divine right. Versailles, the grand palace Louis built just outside Paris, was his masterpiece. It wasn't just a royal residence, it was a tool of political control. By building Versailles, Louis XIV effectively removed the nobles from their power bases in their own provinces and brought them to his court, where they could be watched and controlled. Life at Versailles was lavish, but incredibly hierarchical. The nobility, who had once been the backbone of feudal society, were now reduced to courtiers, whose every action was dictated by the king's will. The king controlled their lives, how they dressed, when they ate whom they could associate with. In return, the nobles offered their loyalty and obedience, ensuring the stability of Louis's reign. Louis XIV also used his absolute power to make France one of the most powerful and influential nations in Europe. He waged wars to expand French territories, solidified France's dominance in European politics, and made the French monarchy the envy of the world. His reign, lasting over 70 years, set the template for what absolute monarchy could be: an unchecked, supreme ruler who governed with divine right, where the king was not only the political leader, but the spiritual and moral leader as well. However, the French monarchy's path to absolute power was not without its drawbacks. As the kings of France accumulated more wealth and influence, they also alienated much of their population. The lavish spending of the monarchy, epitomized by the grandeur of Versailles, put an immense strain on the kingdom's finances. The burden of royal taxation fell heavily on the peasants and commoners, while the nobility and clergy were largely exempt. By the time Louis XIV died in 1714, France was exhausted from years of war and economic strain. Despite the challenges, the French monarchy remained the central force in the country for nearly 2 centuries, until the eruption of the French Revolution in 1789. The revolution, fueled by growing dissatisfaction with the monarchy's excesses, led to the overthrow of King Louis XVI and the abolition of the monarchy. The idea of the absolute ruler, once seen as the foundation of France's power, was replaced by the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet, even after the fall of the monarchy, the legacy of absolute rule remained a shadow over France. The idea that the king was the embodiment of the state, that he had a divine right to rule, was a notion that shaped not just French history but the course of European politics for centuries. From kings who ruled with the approval of their noble vassals to the absolute monarchs who shaped the very fabric of the state, the French monarchy's evolution is a testament to the power of centralized authority and the cost that comes with it. The rise of absolute monarchy in France was more than a political shift. It was the rise of a system that would leave a lasting impact on the history of Europe and eventually the world. The Albigensian Crusade, heretics or heroes. Imagine a time when the very essence of your beliefs could determine whether you lived or died. Picture being part of a religious community, deeply committed to your faith, only to find yourself labeled a heretic by the church. Now, imagine an army descending on your land, burning villages and slaughtering innocent people, all in the name of religious purity. This is the grim backdrop of the Albigensian Crusade, a chapter of medieval history that raises the question: were the people of southern France heretics or heroes? The Albigensian Crusade took place in the early 1300s, between 1209 and 1229. It was sparked by a series of religious and political tensions rooted in the rise of the Cathar faith in the Languedoc region of southern France. To understand this, let's step back and look at the time. The Catholic Church, under the papacy of Pope Innocent III, held immense power over medieval Europe. The Church, with its vast influence, was the gatekeeper of salvation. To be a part of the true faith was not just important, it was life and death. However, in the south of France, something was stirring. A religious movement was gaining ground, one that rejected many of the Catholic Church's teachings and practices. These followers, known as Cathars or Albigensians, named after the town of Albi, believed in a dualist philosophy, teaching that the material world was the creation of a false god and only the spiritual realm was pure. They rejected the power of the Pope, the clergy, and many of the sacraments that defined Catholicism. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, the Cathars were not just heretics, they were a threat to the very fabric of Christian society. This growing religious divide couldn't be ignored for long. In 1209, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade to eliminate the heretic Cathars and restore Catholic orthodoxy. What followed was a brutal campaign that not only sought to wipe out the Cathar faith, but also reshape the political and social landscape of southern France. The Church's call to arms against these heretics was clear. Those who didn't submit to Catholic rule would be destroyed. The Crusade began with a massacre. The first major confrontation took place at the city of Béziers. In the summer of 1209, the crusading army, led by the papal legate Arnaud Amalric, laid siege to the city, which was known to harbour Cathars. When the city's defenders refused to surrender, a bloodbath followed. The Crusaders, unable to distinguish between Cathar heretics and Catholic innocents, slaughtered tens of thousands of people, men, women, and children. When asked how they would know who the heretics were, Arnaud Amalric reportedly said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." The brutality didn't end there. The crusade spread across the region, with cities like Carcassonne, Toulouse, and others falling one by one to the papal forces. Entire communities were destroyed, and the Cathar faith was slowly eradicated through a mix of force, persecution, and fear. But here's the twist. While the Church and its crusaders saw themselves as doing so-called God's work, the people of southern France, including many Catholics who sympathized with the Cathar ideals, saw the crusaders as invaders, not holy warriors. To them, this wasn't just about religion. It was about the preservation of their way of life, their culture, and their freedom from northern French and papal control. Many of the people fighting for the Cathar faith were not just peasants but members of the aristocracy as well. Some of the most powerful lords of the region took up arms in defense of what they believed to be a righteous cause. These lords were fiercely independent and resented the centralization of power in northern France, where the French monarchy was consolidating its authority. The Albigensian Crusade was as much a political struggle as a religious one. The Cathars were not only fighting for their faith, but also for the autonomy of their region. The northern French lords who led the crusade, including figures like Simon de Montfort, sought to impose their control over the south, extending the reach of the monarchy into what had been an independent, somewhat autonomous region. In the face of overwhelming odds, the Cathars held out as best they could. The fortress of Montségur, perched on a remote mountain in the Pyrenees, became a symbol of their resistance. In 1228, the fortress fell to the Crusaders after a long siege. The remaining Cathars, those who refused to renounce their beliefs, were burned alive. It was a devastating blow to the Cathar movement, but not the end. The final blow came in 1229, when the papacy officially declared the Cathar faith eradicated. But what about the people who fought and died for the Cathar cause? Were they simply misguided heretics, as the Church claimed? Or were they heroes defenders of a belief system that, while unconventional, represented a deeper spiritual struggle? The Crusade's aftermath left many questions unanswered, and it's clear that the Cathars weren't just religious rebels, they were deeply committed to a way of life that challenged the oppressive power structures of the time. The legacy of the Albigensian Crusade is complex. On one hand, it served the Church's goal of stamping out heresy and consolidating papal power in the region. On the other hand, it left a lasting bitterness in the hearts of the people of Languedoc, who saw the Crusaders as foreign invaders. In the centuries that followed, the region of southern France would maintain a distinct identity, one that was shaped by the memory of the brutal suppression of the Cathars. Were the Cathars heretics or heroes? Perhaps it's a bit of both. They were heretics in the eyes of the Church, challenging the established order and refusing to bend to papal authority. But to the people who fought alongside them, they were heroes, brave men and women willing to die for what they believed in, for their land, and for a vision of Christianity that was radically different from the one imposed by the Church. The Albigensian Crusade was not just a war over religion, it was a war over identity, autonomy, and the very future of southern France. The echoes of that conflict still resonate in the region today, as people reflect on the price of faith and the struggle for freedom. The Cathars may have been defeated, but their story is far from forgotten. The Estates General, a precursor to revolution. Imagine being in France in the year 1389. The country is teetering on the edge of crisis. The monarchy, struggling to manage a vast, fragmented kingdom, is facing immense pressure from the nobility, the clergy, and the growing dissatisfaction among the common people. At the heart of it all is a new system that seems designed to give everyone a voice, but will it? That system is the Estates General, a medieval assembly that would go on to play a pivotal role in shaping France's future, and perhaps its revolution. It all started with King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, whose reign marked the early development of the Estates General. At the time, the monarchy was under enormous strain, fighting wars, dealing with internal disputes, and managing finances that were drained by years of conflict. The Crown, needing to raise money, turned to the Estates General, a body that represented the three estates of French society: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, or Third Estate. It was meant to be a way of gathering advice, securing support for royal policies, and, above all, raising taxes. In its early years, the Estates General was not so much a power in its own right as a tool for the king to use when he needed it. It was called sporadically, whenever the monarchy needed money or faced a crisis it couldn't handle alone. The clergy and nobility were expected to provide counsel, but the commoners, despite making up the vast majority of the population, rarely had much to say. For centuries, this body functioned as a way of securing royal power, but with very little real influence or power for the people. But over time, things started to change. The Estates General would be called to discuss issues of great national importance, such as the taxation of the clergy, the imposition of war taxes, and the growing unrest among the peasantry. Each time it met, the expectations of the common people grew. They saw the king's summons as an opportunity to address the glaring inequities in French society: unequal taxes, feudal obligations, and corruption at all levels of government. But what they didn't expect was just how reluctant the king would be to truly listen. The most significant moment in the history of the Estates General came in 1393, when King Charles IV, after facing growing unrest, decided to call a meeting. For the first time, the common people, represented by the Third Estate, came to the table with new demands not just for reforms, but for justice. The people wanted to have a voice in the laws and policies that governed them. It was clear now that they were no longer willing to accept the power dynamics that had existed for centuries, where kings and nobles held all the power, and the common folk were left without a say. But it wasn't just about taxes and governance. The Estates General was becoming a symbol of the deep divisions that existed within French society. The clergy, with its vast wealth and power, was not willing to share any of its privileges. The nobility, long accustomed to ruling with impunity, refused to entertain any suggestion that their privileges should be curtailed. And the common people, who had always borne the brunt of royal taxes and feudal obligations, began to demand a voice, one that could shape the future of the kingdom. As the years went on, the calls for reform only grew louder. But despite the growing presence of the Third Estate, the monarchy continued to hold on to its power. Every time the Estates General met, it became increasingly clear that the traditional structure of French society was no longer sustainable. The king, now at the mercy of both the nobility and the clergy, began to lose his grip on power, and the people, those who had once been excluded from governance, started to realize that their fate lay in their own hands. The frustration of the Third Estate was palpable. In the year 1399, a particularly contentious session took place. The common people, now more organized and vocal, demanded a voice in matters of national importance. But they were shut down once again. The nobility and clergy, long accustomed to their privileges, saw no reason to share power, and so the seeds of resentment were sown deeper than ever. The Estates General continued to meet sporadically, and with each session, the tension between the three estates grew. What started as an attempt by the monarchy to control the population and raise funds became, in the eyes of the common people, a tool of inequality and oppression. Every time the Third Estate was ignored or overruled, it pushed the country closer to a breaking point. The Estates General was no longer just a body of advisors. It was a symbol of the growing rift in French society. But the real turning point came at the beginning of the 14th century. The Estates General, once a tool of the monarchy, was now a battleground for competing interests. The common people, having grown frustrated with the status quo, began to demand more than just taxes. They wanted a fair say in how the country was governed. The monarchy, caught in a cycle of internal strife, struggled to respond. And so, the tensions continued to build. Fast forward to the year 1789. The French Revolution is upon us, and the Estates General, once a simple advisory body, is about to undergo its most dramatic transformation. The Third Estate, having long been excluded from meaningful power, would now take center stage. In what would come to be known as the Tennis Court Oath, the representatives of the Third Estate, feeling that their voices had been ignored for far too long, swore never to separate until they had created a new constitution for France. They had been pushed too far, and they would no longer stand in the shadows. The Estates General of the medieval period, with its deep divisions and entrenched power structures, set the stage for the massive social and political upheaval that would follow. The revolution would see the end of the monarchy, the rise of radical change, and the dismantling of the old feudal system. The cries for reform that started in the chambers of the Estates General, where the common people were once powerless, would echo through the streets of Paris, giving birth to the modern French state. So, was the Estates General a precursor to revolution? In many ways, it was. It gave the common people a taste of political engagement and laid bare the inequality that plagued France. It was a mirror to the deep fractures within French society. And though it could never have predicted the scale of the revolution to come, it was a key moment in the history of the French people's struggle for equality and representation. The Estates General may have been born as a tool for monarchy, but in time it became the spark that ignited a revolution, changing the course of French history forever. Medieval French art and architecture, from cathedrals to tapestries. Close your eyes and imagine standing before one of the grandest structures you've ever seen. It's towering over you, its stone walls reaching for the sky, its stained glass windows glinting in the sunlight, casting colourful patterns on the floor beneath your feet. The air smells of incense, and the light feels almost sacred. This is the world of medieval French art and architecture. A world where every stone, every brushstroke, and every piece of fabric told a story. It wasn't just about beauty, it was about faith, power, and the shaping of a new era. Medieval French art and architecture were deeply intertwined with religion. The church was the central force in shaping the culture of the time, and its influence stretched across every facet of life, from the grand cathedrals that dotted the landscape to the intricate illuminated manuscripts that recorded the stories of saints and kings. The architecture of the time, especially the cathedrals, was nothing short of a visual testament to the glory of God and the grandeur of medieval France. The most iconic of these structures were the cathedrals, massive, awe-inspiring buildings that were designed to reflect the power of the church and the divine. The most famous example, of course, is Notre Dame de Paris, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture. When you step into the cathedral, you can't help but feel dwarfed by its scale. The soaring arches, the flying buttresses, and the intricate carvings of biblical scenes create a sense of transcendence. Every part of the building seemed designed to inspire awe, to remind visitors of their place in the grand scheme of things. And this wasn't accidental. The very design of these cathedrals was meant to reflect the divine order of the universe. The Gothic style, which emerged in the 12th century and dominated French architecture for centuries, was all about reaching toward the heavens. The pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses that characterized Gothic cathedrals allowed for taller, more intricate buildings with vast stained glass windows. These windows were not just decorative, they were storytelling devices. They depicted scenes from the Bible creation, the life of Christ, the Last Judgment, using vibrant colors and intricate designs. The light that filtered through these windows was symbolic, representing the divine presence and the illumination of the soul. But Gothic cathedrals weren't the only artistic achievement of medieval France. The period also saw the rise of French tapestry art, which was equally revered for its beauty and craftsmanship. Tapestries were a way of telling stories through intricate needlework, and they often depicted historical events, biblical stories, or the lives of saints. The most famous example of French tapestry is the Bayeux tapestry, though technically it was created in England. Still, its influence on the art of medieval France cannot be overstated. The tapestry, measuring over 70 meters in length, tells the story of the Norman conquest of England in 1066, and its detailed imagery gave rise to a style of tapestry that would dominate French art for centuries. Tapestries were more than just decorative pieces. They were valuable possessions. They adorned the walls of castles and palaces, acting as both art and insulation against the cold. Tapestry weaving became an important craft in medieval France, with workshops in cities like Paris and Arras producing some of the finest examples. These works were often commissioned by the wealthy and powerful, including royalty and the church, and they represented not just wealth, but also prestige. The intricate designs of these tapestries were often influenced by both religious and secular themes. Many featured scenes of courtly love, hunting, or allegorical representations of virtues and vices. They were also a way to communicate power and identity. Kings and queens would commission tapestries to display their wealth and influence, as well as to document significant events in their reign. The creation of these tapestries was a slow and meticulous process, with skilled artisans spending years on each piece. Their work was a labor of love, combining artistry with technical skill. Beyond cathedrals and tapestries, the world of medieval French art was rich with other forms of expression. Illuminated manuscripts, for instance, were another key artistic achievement. These handwritten books, often religious in nature, were painstakingly decorated with intricate borders, miniatures, and calligraphy. Monasteries were the centers of manuscript production, where monks would spend hours painstakingly copying and decorating texts. The most famous of these manuscripts was the Book of Hours, a devotional book used by the wealthy to aid in their daily prayers. These books were works of art in themselves, with pages that shimmered with gold leaf and vivid colors. Sculpture, too, played a vital role in the artistic landscape of medieval France. The detailed stone carvings that adorned the facades of cathedrals depicted scenes from the Bible, as well as portraits of saints and kings. These carvings were often intended to serve as visual lessons for an illiterate population. Sculptures were not only decorative, but also didactic, teaching religious stories to those who could not read. While medieval French art was primarily concerned with religion and the church, it was also a reflection of the social and political climate of the time. The grandeur of the cathedrals and the beauty of the tapestries were symbols of the power and influence of the monarchy and the church. They represented the unity of France under a single faith and a single monarch, a message that resonated deeply during a time when political boundaries were constantly shifting and social order was in flux. But art in medieval France wasn't just about the grand gestures. It was about human emotion and the stories that connected people. Whether it was the quiet devotion of an illuminated manuscript or the joyous celebration of a feast depicted in a tapestry, French medieval art was a testament to the human spirit. It spoke of faith, of power, of life's fleeting beauty, and of the lasting legacy of those who shaped the world. By the time the Gothic period came to an end in the 14th century, the world of medieval French art and architecture had already set the stage for the Renaissance. But the influence of those towering cathedrals, those richly woven tapestries, and those beautifully illuminated manuscripts would not be forgotten. They would continue to inspire generations of artists, reminding us of the incredible creativity and devotion that defined medieval France. The decline of feudalism. Shifting power in medieval France. Picture a world where power is held in the hands of a few, where lords and vassals control the land, and kings reign over their territories from grand castles. For centuries, this was the reality in medieval France, a time dominated by feudalism. But, as with all systems, change is inevitable. By the late Middle Ages, the feudal system that had once been the backbone of French society was beginning to unravel. The decline of feudalism was not an overnight event, but a slow transformation that shifted power in ways that would forever alter the course of French history. Feudalism in France was built on a structure of loyalty and land. Kings granted vast territories to nobles, who, in turn, pledged their military service and loyalty in return. These nobles, called lords, would then divide their lands among vassals, or lesser lords, creating a hierarchical system of relationships. At the bottom of this structure were the peasants, or serfs, who worked the land and provided the economic foundation for the entire system. For much of the medieval period, this system seemed unshakable. The feudal world seemed like it had a steady rhythm. Lords would control their lands, kings would control their realms, and life would go on in a familiar cycle. But, as we know, no system stays the same forever. The first major shift in feudalism came with the rise of a strong, centralized monarchy in France. The Capetian dynasty, which began with Hugh Capet in the 10th century, gradually gained power at the expense of the local lords. By the 13th century, kings like Louis IX had begun to consolidate power, reducing the influence of the nobles. The French monarchy took control of the royal lands, and kings started to claim more authority over their subjects. As kings grew stronger, they began to challenge the power of the nobility, and that, in turn, marked the beginning of the end for the old feudal order. Another key factor in the decline of feudalism was the rise of a strong merchant class. As towns grew and trade flourished, a new middle class emerged. This class wasn't bound by the traditional feudal relationships. Merchants, artisans, and traders didn't owe their wealth to land, and they weren't subject to the whims of feudal lords. The growth of towns meant that peasants were no longer entirely dependent on the land of a lord. They could now make a living through trade and commerce. This shift in economic power gradually weakened the traditional feudal bonds that had once tied peasants to their lords. One of the most significant events that contributed to the decline of feudalism was the 100 Years' War, fought between France and England from 1033 to 1049. The war placed enormous strain on the feudal system. Kings like Philip VI of France were forced to raise armies to fight the English, and to do so, they needed funds. This meant taxing the population more heavily. The traditional feudal levies, where vassals would provide soldiers in exchange for land, could not meet the needs of a long, drawn-out war. Kings began to rely on professional, paid armies rather than feudal levies. And this fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in France. As a result, the power of the nobility who had once provided military service began to wane. At the same time, the long and exhausting conflict weakened the nobility's power even further. Many nobles had invested heavily in the war, losing wealth and land in the process. The war also eroded the traditional bonds of loyalty between lords and vassals. As the war dragged on, it became clear that the feudal system, which had relied so heavily on land and loyalty, was no longer as effective. Instead, kings increasingly relied on paid soldiers, and noble families, once vital to the monarchy, found their power diminishing. Perhaps the most significant factor in the decline of feudalism was the growing centralization of royal power. Kings like Philip IV and Charles V made significant strides in strengthening the monarchy. They reformed the military, created new administrative bodies, and expanded royal authority. These kings began to weaken the influence of the feudal lords, asserting their dominance in ways that the old system could not withstand. One of the key steps in this process was the establishment of royal bureaucracies, which allowed the monarchy to control the kingdom more effectively than ever before. As kings solidified their power, they also began to create institutions that would eventually become part of the modern state. The Estates General, an assembly made up of representatives from the clergy, nobility, and commoners, became an important tool for the king to gather support and manage the kingdom. Although the Estates General was not a parliamentary body in the modern sense, it represented a shift toward more centralized governance and away from the decentralized, fragmented nature of feudalism. By the 14th century, The power of the nobility had diminished significantly. The feudal system's reliance on land and personal loyalty had been replaced by a more centralized, bureaucratic system of governance. Kings no longer relied solely on the feudal system for military support or economic power. Instead, they began to establish professional armies, a centralized tax system, and royal courts that operated outside the control of the nobility. The power of the king became more absolute, and the influence of the feudal lords began to fade. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, further accelerated the decline of feudalism. The devastating plague killed a third of Europe's population, including many peasants. With fewer people available to work the land, wages for labourers increased, and peasants began to demand better conditions. This shift in the balance of power between peasants and lords further eroded the foundations of the feudal system. The surviving peasants, emboldened by their newfound economic power, were less willing to accept the harsh conditions that had previously been the norm. By the end of the 15th century, feudalism in France was a shadow of its former self. The power of the monarchy had grown substantially, while the influence of the nobility had waned. The feudal system, once a bedrock of medieval society, had gradually been replaced by more modern systems of government, economy, and warfare. The decline of feudalism marked a profound shift in French society, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the modern age that was to come. The story of the decline of feudalism is one of shifting power from the hands of local lords to the centralized monarchy, from the feudal peasants to the burgeoning merchant class. It's a tale of transformation, one that helped shape the future of not just France, but all of Europe. And as we look back at this turning point in history, we see how the fall of feudalism laid the groundwork for the rise of the modern state, and how France, in the process, moved ever closer to becoming the powerful nation we recognize today. The end of the medieval era. France on the brink of the Renaissance. It's the year 1492, and the air in France is charged with the promise of change. The medieval world, with its castles, feudal lords, and rigid social hierarchy, is beginning to crumble under the weight of new ideas, new technologies, and a thirst for knowledge that can no longer be ignored. Picture yourself walking through the streets of Paris, where the last whispers of medieval life mix with the sounds of something new, something revolutionary. A world on the cusp of transformation. France is standing on the edge of a new era, the Renaissance. The medieval period had lasted for centuries. It had shaped the foundations of Europe's political, religious, and cultural systems. Yet, by the late 15th century, cracks were beginning to show. The old ways of life, rooted in feudalism and dominated by the church, no longer seemed to fit the world that was slowly emerging. The 100 Years' War, which had ravaged France for most of the 14th and 15th centuries, had finally come to an end, leaving a scarred but united nation. Charles VIII, now King of France, had secured peace with England, and the French monarchy had regained much of its lost territory. But the wounds of the past still lingered, and the country's social and economic fabric was in desperate need of repair. This was the moment when France stood on the precipice of the Renaissance, a period that would radically reshape not just France, but all of Europe. The medieval mindset, with its focus on religious doctrine, rigid hierarchies, and limited exploration, was giving way to a more curious, outward-looking, and intellectual way of thinking. It was a time of rediscovery, of looking back to the classical civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration, and of pushing forward into a future filled with possibility. One of the most significant factors that marked the end of the medieval era in France was the decline of feudalism. The old feudal system, where power was decentralized and divided among local lords, was slowly being replaced by a more centralized monarchy. Kings like Louis XI and Charles VIII had already begun consolidating power, reducing the influence of the nobles and strengthening the monarchy's hold over the country. The days when local lords had near absolute control over their territories were waning, and with the rise of a strong, centralized state came the possibility of more unified rule, more efficient governance, and ultimately more stability. But it wasn't just politics that were changing. The medieval worldview, which had placed religion at the center of life, was also being challenged. The Renaissance brought with it a renewed interest in humanism, the belief that human beings, rather than the divine, were the center of the universe. Thinkers, artists, and philosophers in France began to look beyond religious texts to find meaning in art, literature, and science. The influence of ancient Greek and Roman thought, which had been largely forgotten during the Middle Ages, came rushing back. French scholars, inspired by the works of Aristotle, Plato, and others, began to explore new ideas about politics, ethics, and knowledge. In the world of art, the shift was just as dramatic. Medieval art, with its focus on religious themes and its often stiff, formal style, began to give way to a new kind of expression. Artists started experimenting with perspective, light, and human anatomy, moving away from the flat, symbolic images of the past to a more realistic, human-centered art. In France, artists like Jean Fouquet, who had spent time in Italy, brought back Renaissance influences, infusing French art with a new vitality and depth. This artistic revolution wasn't just confined to the world of painters and sculptors. Architecture, too, began to reflect the changing tastes. The Gothic style, with its soaring cathedrals and intricate stained-glass windows, was slowly being replaced by the classical symmetry and proportion that defined Renaissance architecture. In France, the construction of castles and palaces took on a new, more elegant form, inspired by the classical ideals of balance and harmony. Meanwhile, the scientific world was also experiencing its own renaissance. The medieval world had been dominated by religious explanations for the natural world. But by the late 15th century, scientists and thinkers were beginning to challenge these old ideas. The rise of universities and the spread of printed books allowed new theories to circulate more quickly. The great French scholars of the time, like Guillaume Boudet, began to study classical texts with a new intensity, and the printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, made the spread of knowledge easier than ever before. France, which had long been a center of religious scholarship, was now becoming a hub for intellectual and scientific exploration. But perhaps the most significant symbol of France on the brink of the Renaissance was its growing involvement in European exploration. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, the world seemed vast and unexplored. France, though not yet the colonial giant it would become, was beginning to look beyond its borders. King Charles VIII's ambitions in Italy, though ultimately unsuccessful, marked the beginning of France's involvement in European geopolitics in a new, more expansive way. It was during this time that France began to lay the groundwork for the age of exploration that would define the 16th century, with explorers like Jacques Cartier mapping the New World and bringing back news of far-off lands. The end of the medieval era wasn't just about the decline of the old order. It was about the rise of something new, something that would set the stage for the future. The Renaissance was not just an intellectual or artistic movement, it was a revolution in the way people thought about the world and their place in it. It was a movement that put human beings, not the divine, at the center of everything. It was a time when the thirst for knowledge, for exploration, and for innovation would drive the progress of Europe, and France was right there, at the forefront of it all. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the medieval world finally fell away, and the Renaissance emerged in its place. France, a country that had spent so many years recovering from wars and internal strife, was poised to become a dominant player in the new modern world. The old medieval structures were fading, but they had paved the way for a new, brighter future. And while the world around France was changing, one thing remained constant: the country's indomitable spirit, always ready to face whatever the future might hold. And that's a wrap on medieval France. If you found this boring journey through history interesting, don't forget to like, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives. Hit the bell so you never miss another adventure, whether you're learning or just nodding off. See you in the next one.